Hey folks, so this is a quick video about some of the ideas that I addressed in the last video but didn't get to elaborate on. So one of the major interesting things that I think I've been um, I guess pondering about as of late has been embracing or entertaining the idea that we need a more organic philosophy in our culture, in our scientific methodology, in our philosophy. And it's not that it hasn't existed in the past. It's just that we haven't really embraced it as of late, for one reason or another. So what does this exactly entail, and how isn't science really applying it? Well, it's a tricky discussion because some scientists, I think, do come to this conclusion. That is that reality is a very messy, nonlinear process, and the more we learn about it, the more we kind of discover there's all of these interwoven systems that interact together and synergistically that create the experience we have. So in other words, things happen together. Um, they sort of uh, come in a collective and emergent process, and this is sort of uh, something that has only been discovered, at least in a Western society, um, primarily in this century, when we're coming up against a lot of the limitations of more linear thinking. Um, and really, I guess I would like to address this from a scientific point of view. I don't think science is limited in that it thinks linearly. I think science, as it has stood, and perhaps as a more conservative point of view of science, it is perhaps a little bit too reliant upon linear processes without realizing their limitations. Um, and what I mean by this is basically what we have is an approach that breaks down reality bit by bit and sort of shapes reality into blocks. It tries to understand things part by part by part, very fragmented, inherently fragmented. Not necessarily a scientific methodology, um, but maybe to some degree it is. But really, reality as a whole is so much more complex than linear systems. It seems that the only thing that really is linear is perhaps our ideologies about the world and some of the mechanical systems that we've developed. Now, I don't think this is really a limitation of science, as I've been saying, but rather the beginning of science, really. I think we're still witnessing the birth process of the scientific method. And by that I mean we've taken this linear perspective, this very fragmented perspective, in a nonlinear, complex, interdependent whole that is always moving and flowing and curvy rather than straight-lined. So really what we're dealing with is a reality that is far more complex than our linear simplistic systems, and we're coming to that conclusion as we gather more and more data, and linear processes no longer work as successfully as nonlinear ones, or at least acknowledging nonlinear ones. But the problem with this, and I guess perspective, is really that what we're missing then is complex mathematics, understanding complex processes. I mean, the scientific method is always about what is tangible. So scientifically, these nonlinear processes aren't as tangible as linear, basic, cause and effect, back and forth processes. Those are much easier to understand and observe in the world. And I suppose if that's what you first observe, if you can find a description, for instance, in the scientific method, if you can find a description for something that you think completely describes a process, a causal process, then the assumption is that process is completely explained away by these causal linear processes. And I think as a whole, we've sort of enveloped ourselves around this perspective of a causal reality that is dependent on linear processes, very fragmented thinking to some degree. because the nonlinear processes are things that are a little bit more abstract and vastly more complicated. So this includes processes such as, well, for instance, seeing the space between relationships between object A and B. There's some kind of relationship between A and B that is, I don't know, C. It's something in between the spaces. It's something about more about relationship and dynamics than just about points on a map. So this sort of dynamic point of view, these dynamic systems, are of course much harder to grasp scientifically, to observe, and to even note. I mean, how simplistic really is it to map out the holistic systems of a rainforest? These sort of things are so complex. That is why we probably don't have as much holistic, bigger picture, bottom-up perspectives as much as we have top-down. So to summarize all of this so far, we have a lot of top-down analysis, deconstructing reality, picking it apart as if we were objective observers, or at least to some degree we're still relying on that methodology, even if we don't really believe we're objective anymore. And now we're only beginning to understand that the reality, at least relative to what we can understand now, the reality of systems, of the body, of ecology, of energy, of the universe, is so much more nonlinear and thus vastly more complex. And I think that's why science, as it is, has somewhat of a bias towards more linear methodologies. Only because it, as you know, they say, I'll believe it when I see it, and this is the limitation. I believe it when I see it. Well, what if you only see a limited perspective? Then what you believe is going to be a more limited, or in our case, a fragmented reality that fails to embrace more complex systems. But I think there's something much more hopeful in all this discussion, in that science can embrace more holistic and nonlinear and relational perspectives in the future, especially as the limits of linear perspectives come up against us, particularly in this century, what we're dealing with. The energy crisis, the ecology crisis. There's so many problems that we thought we solved through mechanical systems, where we really needed to understand more organic processes, organic systems. So in other words, the machine, which was triumphed as some kind of transcendence of nature, was actually just the rudimentary understanding of nature, to the point where we dissociated ourselves from thinking nature was somehow inferior to us, thinking natural processes were somehow too chaotic and needed our order, when really our order was just almost like a childish perception of a world vastly beyond perspective, the immediate perspective. And while that may seem a little bit harsh, I think it's a more pragmatic and realistic perspective to know the limitations of how we think, and to also acknowledge emerging systems. I mean, I think it's a very scientific claim to say our view has been fragmented, and yes, there are complex systems, and it seems likely that they can describe the world in much more depth than what we have now. But it's going to take time, and it's going to take patience, but it's also going to take our effort to help encourage this sort of thinking, especially in a world that is so fragmented, even amongst scientists and so many specialists. There needs to be more relational energy. And I think this leads to my final point in suggesting that we have, up until this point, to see it from a more Eastern perspective, the West has been very masculine in its energy, and in its structures of consciousness. It is perhaps encouraged more masculine analytical thinking, while misplacing and dissociating itself from relational thinking, which up until this point has been more in the, I guess, department of aesthetics and art, and it's to the side. But I think they need to come together in order to find a bigger picture. So that's the end of this, and thank you, and please comment.